Hello, everyone. Welcome to this Author Meets Critics session devoted to Samuel Fleischacker's Being Me, Being You, Adam Smith and Empathy. This webinar is co-sponsored by the Philosophy, Politics, and Economics program at UNC Chapel Hill and by the PPE Society. If you don't know about the PPE Society, let me encourage you to go to ppesociety.org. You can join there and get notification of future events. It's free. We host an international conference every spring in New Orleans, and it brings together people from all over the world who share an interest in PPE. I'm handing over the reins of this event to Nir Ben Moshe, who's assistant professor of philosophy at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champagne. He will be serving as the moderator throughout.
Thank you. So thanks, Jeff, for organizing this. It's a pleasure to be here. I'll just introduce all the speakers and lay out what the order of events is going to be this afternoon. So as Jeff noted, we're here to talk about Sam Fleischacker's book, Being Me, Being You, published by the University of Chicago Press just a few months ago in 2019. Sam is the LAS Distinguished Professor of Philosophy at the University of Illinois at Chicago. He's one of the leading Adam Smith scholars, has published many books about Smith, Kant, issues in political philosophy, moral philosophy. Perhaps one of his books that's worth mentioning is his 2004 book on Adam Smith as Wealth of Nations, a Philosophical Companion, that won the Joseph B. Gittler Award by the American Philosophical Association for an outstanding book in the philosophy of social science. And it's, of course, a treat to talk about his new book today. Our two commentators, I mean, officially, I think it's called an Author Meets Critics, but I think they're more commentators than critics. The first commentator is Kate Abramson, an associate professor of philosophy at Indiana University at Bloomington. Katie is a well-known Jung scholar who also writes in contemporary ethics and philosophical feminism. And our second commentator would be Olivia Bailey, an assistant professor of philosophy at Tulane University, who works also on issues at the intersection of the epistemic and the ethical. She's published on empathy, including empathy in Adam Smith. In terms of how we will proceed today, first of all, we'll start with Katie's comments. Sam will have a brief response. If there's any questions about Katie's comments, we can take a couple of questions there at that point. Then Olivia will present her comments. Again, Sam will have his response. A couple of questions about Olivia's commentary. And then at the end, there'll be just a general Q&A. I'll try to keep a queue. I mean, it should be easy given this format, and we'll see how it goes. So I think without further ado, I should turn things over to Kate. You will start us off.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. It is my great pleasure and honor to be included as one of Sam's commentators on his wonderful book on empathy, Being Me, Being You. Sam's most recent book ranges, as is usual for him, over questions in the history of philosophy and contemporary ethics. And here, as always, he shows a great sensitivity to the complexity of our ethical lives, insisting quite rightly that our ethical theories step up to meet that complexity rather than reducing the complexity of ethical life to meet the simplicity of an ethical theory. That's not to say we don't have our disagreements. I'll spend most of my time today talking about three, as it were, in family disagreements. Doing so will, I hope, give Sam a chance to further explore how he'd like to address some of these tricky questions and give us all a chance to think through these matters together. So to begin with, I want to push back a bit against some of Sam's criticisms of Hume. There are various forms of empathy in play in Hume's work, but it's certainly true that the form of empathy, imaginative identification, that lies at the core of Smith's ethics nowhere takes center stage for Hume. Moreover, I'm entirely on Sam's side when it comes to the thought that Smithian imaginative identification plays important roles in our ethical practices. I think, and I think Sam does too, that in different ways, all the forms of empathy discussed by Hume and Smith play important roles in our ethical practices. That said, some of Sam's characterizations of Humean empathy strike me as not entirely fair. I want to highlight 3 points that matter not just as a matter of Hume exegesis, but in terms of how we think about empathy's role in our ethical practices. So first, while Sam acknowledges at the beginning of chapter 2 that Humean empathy sometimes involves ideas and proceeds from inferring what you are feeling from, as Hume says, in the signs and countenance and conversation, in other places, Sam draws the contrast between Humean and Smithian empathy in ways that make the Humean version seem like a dumb brute feel cousin. So for instance, early on, Sam writes that Smithian empathy, but not Humean empathy, quote, has an essential cognitive component, alerting us to the cognitive structure of emotions more generally. That doesn't seem right to me. The forms of sympathy on which Hume principally focuses are all cognitively rich in just those ways as well. So by the time Hume introduces sympathy in this treatise, he has already given the core of his account of pride and humility, and told us that his account of love and hatred will have a parallel structure. Hume claims that these and all the other indirect passions have two objects and what he calls a quality. Translated into 21st century language, what's at issue here are the intelligibility conditions of these affects. That is, in the case of pride and humility, it's their intelligibility conditions that they have me as their subject, something connected to or about me as their object, and have as their cognitive content an evaluation in light of which I consider that in which I take pride as either good or bad. Pride, humility, love, and hatred are all not only cognitively rich for Hume, they and all of their derivatives are also specifically evaluatively laden. And now here's why all this matters when thinking about how Humean empathy works. In its most crude form, Humean empathy works like this. I see your facial expressions, your conduct, I hear your conversation, and form an inference about what it is that you are feeling on that basis. My idea might be more or less specific, but to be an idea of your passion, that idea must include all the basic cognitive elements that are among the intelligibility conditions of your passion. So for instance, I see someone smiling broadly and gently shining his car with a soft cloth and stepping back to view it in evident satisfaction. In coming to know that he is proud of his car in these circumstances, I come to know that he takes it that the car reflects upon him, that it is the car of which he is proud, and that in some fashion or another, he must think his car awfully nifty. Sometimes that's all that happens. I make the inference and I do not come to feel any empathetically felt sentiment myself, but sometimes I go on to empathize. I feel some measure of the pleasure that the proud person feels. When that happens, the relevant cognitive and evaluative content remains constant throughout the transition from an idea into an impression. In fact, just these points are key to understanding why, as the title of this very section of the treatise highlights, Hume thinks that Humean empathy can explain the love of fame. The famous person is admired, esteemed, beloved by many. He empathizes with their admiration of him. The fact that it is he who is admired by them is part of the content of the sentiment he comes to feel as a result of empathizing with them. So now he has a pleasant passion, whose subject is himself, whose object is that about himself the others admire, and whose quality, that is the evaluative content, is whatever may be the description under which he is thought worthy of admiration. That's pride. And thus, on Hume's account, does empathy explain the love of fame. All this requires Humean empathy to be quite cognitively rich. A second aspect in which I think Sam is perhaps not quite as generous as he might have been in interpreting Humean empathy is as passive, or as Sam puts it quite starkly at one point, empathy, quote, largely is for Hume something that just happens to me, end quote. It's true that on Hume's analysis of it's true that Hume's analysis of empathy is full of warnings about the various ways in which our empathetic skills can be affected by factors we would not reflectively choose to have them be affected by. So for instance, our preference for the contiguous to the remote, the mere specificity of our ideas, habits of mind. But all this no more makes empathy something that just happens to us than the fact that we are plagued by implicit biases makes our judgments mental events that just happen to us. Even before we are introduced to that form of Humean empathy, that is extensive sympathy, on which our sentiments of virtue depend, Hume treats empathy as both something that we can find ourselves doing, and in that sense, something that just happens to us, but also something we can choose to undertake, describing it, for instance, as something involving, quote, a great effort of imagination, end quote. By the same token, it also seems to me that, in fact, Smithian sympathy can be just as passive as Humean empathy. The Kahneman and Tversky study that Sam cites is actually a pretty good example of this. Subjects were told stories about two people, one who misses their flight by half an hour, the other who misses their flight by 5 minutes. Subjects consistently felt worse for the guy who barely missed his flight. Both Steve Darwell and Sam read this as a case in which the form of empathy operative is Smithian. The subjects of the study are imagining themselves in these missing flight scenario. That seems entirely plausible to me. But the subjects of the study weren't asked to empathize. They weren't even asked to imagine themselves in the shoes of these would-be flyers. They just did, automatically, passively, dare I say. And this is an experience that's familiar in everyday life. When I see someone about to shut her hand in her office door and wince as I cry out, wait, I'm not deliberately undertaking to imagine myself in her shoes, in her situation. I just do. Decent enough folks form habits of so empathizing that are so entrenched, we are passive most of the time in the fact of our engagement in them. And this brings me to the third aspect of Sam's description of Humean empathy, about which I'd like to push back a bit. Sam consistently refers to Humean empathy as contagion. I think that's misleading for three reasons. Two of them I've already mentioned implicitly, at least. Talk of emotional contagion suggests a form of empathy that's cognitively and evaluatively empty, and a form of empathy that's passive. Neither of these, as I've already noted, are apt characterizations of Humean empathy. Add to this a third reason, namely that I do think that there is a phenomenon that is aptly called emotional contagion or empathetic contagion. Anyone who has spent time in a room with more than one infant is familiar with this phenomenon. It's the reason why one tries to get the one crying infant as far away from the other as yet not crying infants as quickly as possible. Infants, when they catch cries from one another, are obviously not inferring one another's emotional states, much less making evaluative judgments about the content of the objects of the respective evaluative states. This is genuine emotional contagion. It's very different from Humean empathy. Now, one might think that even so, Humean empathy is second best to Smithian empathy, for the latter is in a certain way more interpersonally rich insofar as it involves imagining myself in the whole of another's circumstances. But whether that fact makes Humean empathy a second best alternative depends on the purpose for the sake of which we're empathizing. For instance, at one point, Sam suggests that Smithian empathy has a more important role to play in moral development than Humean empathy because, and I quote, as we learn to think about how we would feel if someone did this or that to us, we develop our powers of imagination and learn ways of controlling our emotions, end quote. Such skills in imaginative identification are certainly one of the ways in which we develop these emotional skills. But they come fairly late in the process of emotional development, and they rest on prior capacities of emotional self-control that are much more plausibly thought the result of exercises in human empathy. There is, for instance, a kind of parent-infant interaction that some psychoanalysts call containment, and which is widely held, both in and outside of psychoanalysis, to be key to a child's emotional development. So picture a parent holding a crying infant. The good enough parent will interact with the infant in a way that doesn't just communicate a shared pain, but will communicate back to the infant that pain in a way that manages it, contains it, within a framework of compassion that makes it bearable. It's hard to describe abstractly, but we've all seen it. The infant is crying, and you cradle her saying softly and with concern, "Oh, I know it's hard. I'm right here. It'll be okay." The appropriately empathetic parent isn't imagining what it's like to be that infant in those circumstances. If he tried, he'd fail. None of us have the slightest idea, really, what it's like to be an upset pre-verbal infant. But we are familiar as adults with the kind of upset that has an overtone of vulnerability and feeling out of control. And we can empathize in the human sense with that emotion. That's what the decent enough parent does, then transforming the empathetically felt emotion, altering its tone, framing it with compassion, and offering it back to the child in bearable form. Those human lessons are the children's first moments of learning emotional self-management. Okay, I'm going to come back to the thought that engaging in Smithian sympathy or empathy is sometimes impossible in the third part of my remarks today. For now, however, I want to turn to my second topic, Hume's famous complaint about Smithian sympathy or empathy. Smith says that sympathizing with another is always pleasurable. And Hume complains in response that if this were true, we should expect people to find hospitals more entertaining than a ball. Smith responded by adding a footnote saying that while sympathy with an unpleasant feeling is, of course, unpleasant, when we, quote, observe the perfect coincidence, end quote, between our two unpleasant feelings, we take pleasure in the fact that we are both feeling the same thing. And Sam defends Smith's view here, now quoting Sam. The reason why awareness of mutual empathy is always pleasurable is that in it, we are reassured that we participate in a common humanity. We find that our feelings are characteristic of the human community, and we experience that as comforting and encouraging. We don't want to be idiosyncratic in our feelings. Finding that others feel as I do signals my membership in the general human community. That's always a pleasure, end quote. It's a lovely sentiment. Yet with Hume, I think that the always claim here is a step too far. There are a variety of ordinary situations in which decent enough folks do not find it at all pleasurable to be aware that others as they do. Take situations of grief. Sam is right that sometimes being with others who grieve as I do is comforting, but sometimes it's overwhelming. I grieve. I'm aware that you grieve too. You grieve with me and I grieve with you. And my second order awareness of our mutual grieving only adds to the weight of the grief, aggravating rather than ameliorating it. Finding that our feelings are characteristic of the human community is not always comforting. And I think everyday life bears this out. Parents who go through the horror of losing a child often have a very hard time maintaining their marriage. Their shared grief and awareness thereof makes things more rather than less difficult. And on the other hand, there are times when not wanting others to share in one's feelings, even imaginatively, can be psychologically vital. The teenager who has developed a new passion for some hobby quite rightly will sometimes actively want their parent to not share their feelings about the new hobby. It's crucial that they be able to differentiate themselves in this way. And the same is true for adults. Spouses who insist or even wish the other feel with them as they feel about all the things they have feelings about quickly become an enmeshed mess. I'm not sure how important it is to Sam to side with Smith on this particular claim, that finding others feel as I do is always pleasurable. I'd be really interested to hear more from him about how he sees this particular point as fitting into his larger view. Okay, so now sometimes when we don't want others to feel as we do still want them to feel something with us, an emotion that appropriately resonates with our own, but is not our own and does not pretend to it. And this brings me to the third and final topic that I wish to raise today, namely whether Sam has perhaps drawn the boundaries around empathy too narrowly, and too narrowly for his own purposes. There are cases in everyday life that are sometimes referred to as instances of empathy, which, because they involve neither sharing of perspective, a la Smith, nor in any way sharing of feeling, a la Hume, Sam doesn't want to count as empathy. To take a case Sam mentions, we speak of doctors as empathizing with their patients, but I do not want my doctor to feel my anxiety, fear, stress. I want them to respond in an emotionally attuned way to my fear. Their emotional notes shouldn't be the same as mine, but together their emotions and mine should form a kind of chord. Sam doesn't think we should call this a case of empathy. I do. We could see this as a merely verbal dispute. After all, there's tremendous variation in how we use the word empathy, and the boundaries Sam is drawing around it are at least as recognizable as the ones I'm proposing. But I'm hoping that I can convince Sam to consider, for the next book maybe, expanding his boundaries. I think the limits of Smithian empathy, the complexity of ethical life, and Sam's own goals all give him reason to do so. So in Smithian empathy, I imagine what I would feel were I in your circumstances. Indeed, in one version of this imaginative identification, Smith writes that what I imagine is what I should suffer if I were really you, and I not only change circumstances with you, but persons and character. Smith himself knows that this isn't always possible. For instance, even while insisting that a man could empathize in some sense with a woman who is giving birth, he notes, quote, "It is impossible he should conceive of himself as suffering her pains in his own proper person and character," end quote. And yet, our situation in this regard is actually worse than Smith makes it out to be. Many of Sam's own examples rightly bring out the difficulties we have in imagining ourselves in situations quite unlike our own, differences across religious, personal, and cultural boundaries, which not only inform our experiences of the world, but the very ways in which our empathetic skills operate and are directed. These limitations, both epistemic and affective, tend to focus our Smithian empathy on people close to us, people we already care about, our own tribes, creating what Hume calls factions of affection. Empathy's critics would have us simply throw up our hands and focus instead on roughly utilitarian calculations. That solves nothing, as Sam points out. Utilitarianism never did. Instead, says Sam, quote, "A better response to the problem of biased or tribal empathy is to use empathy against the characteristic pitfalls of empathy, to open out our local groups by way of empathy so that we can expand the range of empathetic concern to human beings generally," end quote. Sam's examples of the many ways in which we can use empathy against its own characteristic pitfalls are both remarkably sensitive to the details of how these things play out in everyday life, and philosophically astute in highlighting the various points at which empathy can enter into our moral deliberations. He argues that it can help us get a sense of the dignity harm involved in anti-trans bathroom laws, can help us understand why Bengali women would insist against apparent evidence that their health doesn't suffer, can draw us into the worldview of the Muslim who experiences drawings of Muhammad as painful, and can more generally enable us to, quote, "appreciate and take seriously one another's cultural and historical placement." All that seems right to me. And I agree, moreover, that one very common problem when it comes to failed attempts at Smithian empathy is that people in various ways just don't try hard enough. Still, it's not always possible. Here's an example I've used elsewhere in a piece co-authored with Adam Late. Ashley Nicole Black, a Black member of the Second City Comedy Group and writer for the TV show Full Frontal with Samantha Bee, put together a semi-humorous set of recommendations for white people for talking about race and racism with their Black friends. Here's one item on her list of don'ts. Don't say, a similar thing happened to me once. I'm afraid of the cops too. Stop. No, it didn't, and no, you aren't. Comparing an isolated incident, systematic oppression is trivializing, even when it comes from a place of wanting to sympathize. Black and white people have very different experiences in this country. That's just true. If we pretend it isn't true, we can't fix it, end quote. She does, however, think that white people can interact empathetically with their Black friends about such issues. In these cases, she recommends, quote, empathy sounds like, I'm sorry you feel that way. That sounds really hard. Here, I baked you a giant cookie, end quote. In terms of Smithian empathy, the failure at issue here is epistemic. There's nothing a white person can do that will really result in our ability to imagine what it is like to be a Black person living in 21st century US context. If I cannot adequately imagine myself in your shoes, I cannot adequately empathize with you in the Smithian sense. And if that's all there is for empathy to be, I cannot empathize. But that just doesn't seem right. There is something I can offer, something which is more than indicating that I care about my Black friends and don't like it when they are in pain. What I can offer is an attuned emotional response, expressed, yes, perhaps in a gesture like a giant cookie, that qualifies as empathetic. Here's another example. Like many women, I've been sexually harassed. Every so often I tell the story. If a guy were to say to me, I know what that's like, or I can imagine what that's like, they would be wrong. No, they can't. Not even if they have been sexually harassed themselves. They can glimmer some of the feelings involved, but they cannot imaginably identify with this situation. Sexism is real, and one thing that means is that the tone, meaning, and implications of an experience like this is different for a woman. But that's okay. It's okay because in my view, it's not necessary for empathy. I remember many years ago when I somewhat matter-of-factly told the story to a male friend. He leaned across the table to me when I'd finished and, seething through his teeth in anger, uttered with an evident effort to remain calm, "Who was that?" That's empathy. But why? And why similarly did Ashley and Nicole Black call the gesture of a giant cookie empathetic? Here's my suggestion. Because while no sentiment or feeling or perspective is shared in these cases, a common cause is forged between the two parties through the emotional connection that is made on account of the appropriately attuned emotional response. I suggest that perhaps Sam himself might want to expand his conception of empathy to include these kinds of cases. If we don't include cases like these as instances of empathy, then we're missing out on important ways in which we can achieve Sam's own goals through a forged, emotionally attuned, emotional connection. Empathy, Sam argues, gives us a sense of solidarity, a sense of being in community with other human beings. It both requires and gives us, quote, an awareness that the other person with whom we are sympathizing has a distinctive perspective. And it provides, quote, a feeling of common humanity. It should allow us to, quote, expand the range of our empathetic concern to human beings more generally. We do need all of this. But to get there, we'll need to both expand our empathy and our conception of empathy. And that's it for me.
So now we'll have, so first of all, thank you, Katie, for those wonderful comments. And now we'll have a short response by Sam, followed by some questions.
Katie, thank you so much. As I said when we met in New Orleans, I always think of Katie as Hume's 20th century reincarnation. If I have any question about what Hume would say, I just think, oh, I'll call or email Katie. And indeed, here too, she provides a wonderful defense of Hume's views, and I think that that makes the contrast or some of the differences between us, even within a common framework, all that more interesting. And I actually think her own objections or concerns towards the end also are richly interesting, and I'm only going to be able to touch on my thoughts about them thus far. But, as always, as there was for you, back to Hume for a minute. One of the things that Katie's very rich understanding and sympathy, if I may say so, or empathy for Hume, brings out is nuances in his account that not everyone might necessarily pick up. And I will confess that I hadn't thought about the placement of Hume's treatment of sympathy in the rest of the treatise. And I think her account is, her reading is very plausible and very nuanced. On the other hand, Hume himself introduces sympathy at the very beginning of his discussion of it in the treatise. His first example is children who implicitly embrace every opinion proposed to them, that's his quote, and quote, men of the greatest judgment and understanding who find it very difficult to follow their own reason or inclination in opposition to that of their friends and daily companions. Before that paragraph is out, we get sympathy or empathy used as an explanation of how people of the same nation share the same humors and turn of thinking without being aware of that consciously. And before the paragraph is out, we get one of the most famous bits in Hume's account of sympathy, which I use quite often to demonstrate what I call his contagion view. Quote, a cheerful countenance infuses a sensible complacency and serenity into my mind, as an angry or sorrowful one throws a sudden damp on me. So that's very much language that's in which sympathy seems to be bypassing our cognitive faculties to a considerable extent and happening to us. We're passive in regard to it as opposed to our having control over it. And there's similar language in much of the treatise, as when Hume says, quote, the present misery of another diffuses its influence over all the ideas related to that person's condition. Or later when he says, quote, as in strings equally wound up, the motion of one communicates itself to the rest, so all the affections readily pass from one person to another. And in fact, Hume himself uses the word contagion for his account of sympathy, saying, quote, that the passions are so contagious that they pass with the greatest facility from one person to another, which I think might be a good reason why a lot of commentators on Hume describe his account as a contagion account and contrast it with what they see as a projection account in Smith. Now, all of this is bits of his language, and you could say that's not his official account. These are metaphors that he uses, and what he really means might be deeper, but at the very least, the metaphor, this kind of metaphor in which sympathy just passes through us, leads to changes in us without us even being fully aware of it, and certainly without being in control of the process. It runs through a lot of the book. I think it was, therefore, at least it's the way Hume has often been read, rightly or wrongly, probably in part by Smith, although he was a very close reader of the treatise. And I think Smith takes himself to have a very different and much more cognitively rich account, in that he thinks we're imagining ourselves into the other situation. This is not a dispute we're likely to resolve here, how to read Hume correctly, but I do think there's at least a good deal to be said for the contagion reading of the treatise, which is, after all, not uncommon. Moreover, I don't think that the sort of brute reading, as it were, in which we are passive in regard to empathy is altogether to Hume's disadvantage. I think there are things that Hume explains better than Smith, even on that most, as it were, crude reading of what's going on, or that most non-cognitive reading, shall we say. It explains nationalism. It explains the way feelings pass through crowds, the sorts of things that Elias Canetti discusses in Crowds and Fire. It also explains, as you said quite wonderfully, the kind of feeling that a parent can have for a crying infant, and the ways in which we learn to control contain was the term that you used, respond sensitively to the crying of an infant. So I think there are all kinds of ways in which, even if one takes a much less cognitively rich picture of human empathy. It does work that Smithian empathy doesn't do, and and is a good thing, although it won't do some of the things that Smithian empathy does. So moving along, since I don't want to go on for too long, to your point about people, empathy being always pleasing. It's important that Smith himself says, and I follow him in this, and it's the only plausible way of looking at it, that even if there is some pleasure in the fact of shared feeling, a pleasure which I cash out as the feeling of human solidarity, of knowing that you have the same kinds of feelings as other people, that pleasure can be overridden quite strongly by the pain of the feeling itself, so that the overall feeling may still be extremely painful. So when you're in deep grief, even if you feel some comfort from somebody else grieving with you, that may very well not overwhelm the grief, the actual grief. Moreover, a distinction that I draw in the book, although maybe too briefly, that I think is quite important, is between the empathy we have and the expression of that empathy. And certainly sometimes with a grieving person, they may not be somebody that wants you to come up and tell them how badly you feel for them. They may want to be left alone. And indeed, if you empathize with them properly, if you understand this person in this situation, you may know that your best response is not to go up and weep all over and tell them how badly you feel for them, that may in fact not be a show that you don't really understand them or their feeling. And I think that point carries over to the examples that you give at the end, which are very interesting. They raise a number of kinds of considerations, I think, they raise situations in which certainly thinking too quickly, oh, I share your feeling, would be a huge mistake. But I don't know that I would fully share your analysis of them. So first, just to link it back to the prior point that I just made, even if I were to share somebody's experience, when they're in the midst of their grieving or anger or whatever, for me to say, oh, I know just how you feel, may be extremely insensitive. And in the cases you mentioned, where it's a man trying to claim that he understands how a woman feels who's been harassed, or a white person telling that to a black person, there's a political implication of saying that, which is to diminish the importance of sexism and racism in this society, which one should avoid at all costs, even if you've had a similar experience. But as you say, the likelihood is, and indeed maybe it's a conceptual truth, that a man is not going to have the same experience as a woman in this sexist society, even if they've been sexually harassed. And certainly a white man who's had a bad encounter with the cops has nothing like the experience of black people who are constantly worrying about surveillance or harassment by white cops, or black cops for that matter. However, there's a leap from saying that to saying that you can't empathize, at least in the Smithian way. Because it isn't true, it cannot be true if Smithian empathy has any chance of playing a role in our lives, that has to be based on our own experience. I, thank God, have never lost a child, but I presumably can empathize with a parent who has lost a child. I have not been desperately poor. I don't know what it's like to grow up in Appalachia, but I can read Hillbilly Elegy and I think empathize with what's going on there. I, on the other hand, don't like baseball and I don't like stamp collecting. But I think I can empathize imaginatively with someone who does, in a positive sense. So I don't think that the limits of empathy need to be drawn around the limits of our own experience, certainly not the Smithian conception. That does raise some powerful questions, difficult questions about how it is possible in imagination to share someone's experience without actually have had a kind of that experience. Maybe it's by way of what you even would be willing to call glimmers of how somebody feels in a different situation. Maybe there's some kind of transfer from by analogy or something like that. Certainly, in any case, to think you're expressing empathy as a white person, to a black person who has suffered harassment by the cops by saying, I've done the same thing, that would show you are not empathizing. You don't understand how they feel. similar to the grieving case, I think. But that doesn't mean that you're incapable of using Smithian empathy in this case. Do I have any more time, or should I wrap it up about now? I could add one more point.
Yeah, go for it.
What's that?
Go for it.
Okay. So the one other thing I'd like to add is that I think Smithian empathy can help us in understanding even the limits of empathy. Because one of the things that you can understand by way of Smithian empathy is why other people might not want you to empathize. Might not want you at least to express your empathy, might not want you to say that you feel the same as they do or you share their experience. And here, this is where I would like to end. I use E.M. Forster's Passage to India quite a bit in the book, which I think is a wonderful, wonderfully empathetic novel, one filled with Smithian empathy in many different ways. But at the end of the book, one of the things that Forster quite tragically, in a way, faces up to, honestly and tragically, is the difficulty or maybe the impossibility of a white man like himself, the Englishman who is the hero of the novel, Fielding, may have in empathizing with Indians under the conditions of oppression of the time. And he brings that out at the very end of the novel by having the English character Fielding try to come together with his friend Aziz, saying to him, after Aziz has indicated that they can't really be friends anymore, Aziz, who has woken up to his colonial situation and to the situation of oppression he lives on, Fielding says, why can't we be friends now? And it's what I want, it's what you want. And then the book ends with these words, but the horses didn't want it. They swerved apart. The earth didn't want it, sending up rocks through which riders must pass single file, the temple, the tank, the jail, the palace, the birds, the carrion, the guest house that came into view as they emerged from the gap and saw Mao beneath. They didn't want it. They said in their 100 voices, no, not yet. And the sky said, no, not there. I think that is a fabulous presentation by the novelist Forster of the difficulties of empathy. And that's something I certainly don't want to deny, but that may come out, but here Smithian empathy even helps us appreciate that point, I think.
Okay, so Sam, thanks very much for that response. So what we'll do now, people can type questions. I hope you can all figure it out, and I'll figure it out to read them. I'll read your questions. I'll just say we do have a general Q&A at the end. So here we should focus on questions that pertain specifically to Katie's remarks and Sam's response. And if you have more general questions about these topics, perhaps keep them for the last round. So type any questions you might have, and hopefully I'll actually see them.
I think just because of time, we should move on now because we're halfway through our time.
Okay, fair enough. So we'll do Q&A later. So up next we have Olivia Bailey, who's our second commentator.
I'm going to begin with some praise. In the theory of moral sentiments, Adam Smith artfully differentiates between two sorts of attitude we can take toward another's sentiments concerning matters of art, nature, and philosophy. On the one hand, he says, we can find that we share a sentiment about some matter that is obvious and easy. In that case, we'll approve of the other's judgment and take pleasure in the agreeable discovery that we see things in the same evaluative light, without recognizing the other sentiment as particularly praiseworthy or particularly remarkable. And that case is contrasted with another sort of relation we can stand into the sentiments of another. So here's Smith. When they, the sentiments, not only coincide with our own, but lead and direct our own. When informing them, he appears to have attended to many things which we have overlooked, and to have adjusted them to all the various circumstances of their objects. We not only approve of them, but wonder and are surprised at their uncommon and unexpected acuteness and comprehensiveness. And he appears to deserve a very high degree of admiration and applause. So that's Smith. Now for me, the experience of reading Being Me, Being You was most definitely one that elicited a reaction of the second sort. There is a very great pleasure to be found in the acuteness and comprehensiveness of Sam Fleischacker's treatment of empathy. Fleischacker lands some important critical blows when it comes to the recent literature on empathy, pointing out both that many analyses of empathy and its significance have suffered from a sort of slipperiness with regard to what exactly their target phenomenon is, And also, he also points out that skeptics about empathy's positive moral value have not sufficiently attended to the very real limitations of their preferred non-empathetic moral psychological mechanisms. But the real triumph of this book for me is in the bold and complex positive vision it offers of both empathy's nature and its contribution to our lives as social and moral beings. One that takes us well beyond the usual rather narrow focus on whether empathy is strictly necessary or sufficient for either of both or both of, one, forming moral judgments, or two, being motivated to act pro-socially. And one of the real strengths of this book is its breadth and the way that it moves nimbly between different dimensions of empathy's significance. I'm going to limit myself here, though, to only a couple of focal points, mostly dealing with the characterization of empathy. The first point I want to concentrate on is Fleischacker's handling of one of the standard dogmas of philosophical and psychological analysis of empathy, the supposedly critical difference between imagining being oneself in another's position, on the one hand, and imagining being the other, on the other hand, and a problem that emerges in this area about the very possibility of that second sort of imagining, the imagining being the other. Now, it's customary in the literature to insist that the distinction between these two forms of imagination runs deep and is highly morally and epistemically significant. So typically, the latter form of imagination comes out looking better, right? It's suggested that this form of imagination is more liable to yield novel insight and also more likely to promote helping behavior in high-cost circumstances. However, Peter Goldie not only drew a sharp distinction between these two forms of imagination, but also mounted a memorable and provocative attack on the desirability, or perhaps it would be more correct to say the possibility, of the latter sort of imagination. Goldie claims that he is not against what he calls in his shoes perspective shifting, which amounts to, quote, consciously and intentionally shifting your perspective in order to imagine what thoughts, feelings, decisions, and so on you would arrive at if you were in the other circumstances. Not against that. What he is against is empathetic perspective shifting, where that means, quote, consciously and intentionally shifting your perspective in order to imagine being the other person and thereby sharing in his or her thoughts, feelings, decisions, and other aspects of their psychology. Now, I have found myself troubled by Goldie's critique of what he calls empathetic perspective taking. So let me briefly sketch out Goldie's critique and then see what resources Fleischacker might be offering us to respond to it. Goldie argues that there's no particular problem with simply imagining being in another situation, with all of our sensibilities and character traits intact. But there is a very serious problem when it comes to the second sort of purported imaginative activity. We cannot simply imaginatively assume the new ways of thinking and attending associated with a character trait that is not our own. The problem, he is keen to emphasize, is not a contingent concern about the limited extent of our imagination. Rather, the charge is that, quote, empathetic perspective taking is not able to operate with the appropriately full-blooded notion of first personal agency that is involved in deliberation. Why not? Well, think about how our character is typically implicated in our deliberation. Character undoubtedly shapes our deliberation, helping to determine which possibilities show up for us as options, how careful we are in our reflection, and so forth. But our deliberation does not typically invoke our character as one fact among others to be considered. So we don't usually think to ourselves, well, this is a situation that called for social courage, but I'm a timorous person and therefore I'm deciding to shy away. We may sometimes reckon with our own personalities, dimensions of our own personality as fixed features, conditions just to be coped with, right? So I might say, I am a very timorous person. That's just a fact about me, like the facts that I'm 33 years old and the fact that I live in New Orleans. But a person who treats her character as a fixed fact to be accommodated is holding her own personality at arm's length. She is alienated from it. I suppose the worry for Goldie is that we as empathizers cannot effectively shift our perspective to accommodate differences in character, except us relating to it in an alienated way that is still fundamentally unlike the other's relation to her character. I, as the empathizer, cannot simply keep the other's characterization, quote, in the non-conscious background in my imaginative exercise of wondering what another will decide to do in a certain situation, end quote. What would be required in order for genuine empathetic perspective taking vis-a-vis a timorous person would be for me to somehow allow my thoughts, my desires, my attention to be directed in the ways characteristic of timorousness without entertaining the thought, I am timorous. Or rather, to change our way of reasoning or feeling without letting awareness of that shift bleed into our imagined perspective. Goldie allows that might be the kind of thing that a method actor can do, but it certainly can't be a normal part of our relating to other people. Now, Fleischacker seeks to challenge the notion that there are two distinctive kinds of empathy, that we can easily, cleanly, and non-arbitrarily distinguish between simply imagining being in your situation and imagining being you. As he quite rightly points out, what counts as a person's situation cannot neatly be separated from facts about our feeling or character. Our situations depend upon who we are, and vice versa. Whether the situation is an emergency, a catastrophe, or just an exciting challenge, that's going to depend in large part on what we ourselves are like. We cannot simply distill all the characterological facts out of a situation. And what's more, who we are, what our character is like, doesn't float free from our history of inhabiting various positions and experiences. I think that Fleischacker is spot on here. But we could imagine putting the point to Goldie and getting this sort of response. It must be conceded to Fleischacker that there is in fact no bright line between in his shoes perspective taking and empathetic perspective taking. But the right conclusion to draw from that concession is that what it is possible for us to imagine in a non-distorted way is still more limited than we had thought. It's bad news here, right? We have been mistaken about the possibility of imaginatively encountering a situation through the lens of another's character. And we should also grant that there are situations, many situations, almost all situations, that we simply cannot imaginatively find our way into because the conception of the situation itself requires a sensibility that is not available to the empathizer in anything like the unself-conscious, non-alienated way that it shows up in the psychology of the one who's empathized with. And this sort of response I'm imagining on behalf of Goldie would picture the scope of effective, non-distorting perspective taking as very dramatically diminished. Now, Fleischacker is keenly aware of the danger of distorting empathy through the illegitimate reification of the other's point of view. He warns that, quote, empathy requires that we not freeze the perspective of the people with whom we are imagining, not lock it into one determinate form, end quote. That would seem to suggest that he'll be sympathetic to the worry posed by Goldie about the task of becoming the other in imagination. Both Goldie and Fleischacker will at least agree, I think, that when it comes to imaginatively assuming aspects of the other's character, we had better not simply say to ourselves, right, and now let me suppose that I'm timorous and will definitely think in timorous ways, which I know from experience of timorous people to be such and such. But unlike Goldie, Fleischacker also seems not to be so pessimistic about the possibility of empathetic imaginative shifts in character, if I'm reading him correctly. He writes, quote, so even to enter the other situation properly, I must become her to a significant degree. I can't so much as try on her shoes if I remain wholly me in imagination. Fleischacker regards fully empathetic perspective taking and in his shoes imagining as poles on a spectrum along which we can move fluidly. And presumably he does not think that moving toward imaginatively adopting the other's characterization just means reproducing the other's outlook in a more and more grossly distorted way. So the question for Fleischacker is, how are we meant to engage in the becoming of her to a significant degree in a way that doesn't involve falling into the sort of distortion that Goldie is worried about? Now, one thing Fleischacker points out, and again, I think this is a really valuable observation, is my own character is not totally determinate. It is itself open to shaping and reshaping through various practices, including the practice of perspective taking. And someone who empathizes well and in good faith should be open to the possibility that new and unexpected ways of apprehending the world will occur to them. So it might be that I can find it within myself to actually apprehend the situation in the same light that someone else does, even if that way of seeing is not in line with my previous patterns of interpretation or with my self-conception. But even if we allow that we are not best thought of as being rigidly locked into particular determinate patterns of seeing that are themselves unmodifiable via empathy, I don't think we want to deny that there are definite differences in sensibility that significantly impact how we process the world. Smith himself would not, I think, deny that some of us are more introverted, that some of us are more attentive, and so on. In fact, the idea that we have differing sensibilities, and that these differing sensibilities are at least stable enough that we can be morally assessed in virtue of them, is a cornerstone of his virtue ethics. Goldie thinks that insofar as these differences in sensibility are real, no empathy in his sense of the term can possibly be successful. I would just like to get a little bit clear on exactly how or whether Fleischacker would respond to this sort of worry. Is the Fleischackerian response something along these lines? Goldie is right that we cannot really borrow sensibilities which are genuinely alien to us for the purposes of empathizing without significant distortion. But once we understand the fluidity of our construction of character, we will see that in fact the whole idea that empathy involves borrowing sensibilities is actually wrong-headed. That's one line of response I could imagine. Or will Fleischacker grant that yes, distortion is inevitable when it comes to our attempts to imaginatively assume different characters, but then suggest that this distortion does not in fact doom the whole project of becoming her to a significant degree, once the ambitions for that project are realistically constrained. It's the second option, or perhaps the response will be along still another line. Okay, I now want to turn a bit more briefly to a different topic. I want to touch on Fleischacker's very interesting remarks at the end of the book in a chapter concerned with demonization. Demonization, Fleischacker tells us, can take a couple of different sorts of forms, one more extreme than the other. The first mode of demonization involves regarding someone as driven by a love of evil for evil's sake. The second mode of demonization involves attributing to others evil desires that we do not think are possible for us, and describing others' actions as guided by those desires. Fleischacker ties demonization very tightly to a refusal to empathize. He says that this is what demonization is in essence. So he explains, quote, refusing to demonize anyone, even the Nazis and white nationalists who themselves make a fetish out of demonizing others, is essential to a humanistic outlook. And he writes further, quote, we demonize people when we give up on the effort to empathize with them, when we give up on the effort to extend our sense of common humanity to them. So I think that identifying demonization with a refusal to empathize is a powerful and exciting move. I also have a couple of questions about it. So first question, I wonder whether what is really critical to demonization is that we fail to empathize, or more particularly that we refuse to empathize. Fleischacker prefers formulations that more readily suggest the latter, although some phrases do sound to my ear more like the former. So he writes, quote, we cut off shared humanity with people when that we demonize. We do not see ourselves as driven and shaped by the same sorts of responses to experience. Now there, to me, it sounds like almost like what matters more there is failure. And he goes on to say, we refuse to acknowledge that we could have ever arrived at their perspectives. And here, to me, that sounds like an emphasis on refusal in particular. Now, maybe Fleischacker won't be interested in this purported difference. Perhaps he thinks the only way we can get this sort of failure is through refusal. But I wonder if sometimes something I would be inclined to call demonization arises not through refusal, but rather through a kind of imaginative collapse. Perhaps we try really hard to empathetically access the other's perspective, but we don't succeed. And so we conclude that their motives must be bad, alien ones. A second question about demonization, and my final question for now. Fleischacker identifies the refusal to empathize with the refusal to, quote, acknowledge that I could have been him and he could have been me. I have often heard that sort of turn of phrase, used to describe a characteristically empathetic insight, and yet I must imagine that I find it rather puzzling. The thought that I could have been another person or shared another person's attitudes seems to be the sort of insight I might manage from a purely third-personal perspective. So I can recognize that if I were born into a plantation-owning family in the South around the time of the Revolutionary War, I probably would have regarded slavery as morally acceptable. And it seems to me that I can do that without any imaginative perspective taking, just based on my knowledge of what attitudes were typical for that time and social position. In fact, I might both acknowledge that this would be an attitude I would be likely to have myself, acknowledge that I could have had that attitude, and positively refuse to engage with it empathetically. So the insight, "I could have been him," must admit of another reading. At one point, Fleischacker links the thought that I could have been you with the thought that, quote, "I recognize how your dispositions and attitudes amount to more or less appropriate responses to your experience." Now that does seem to me to be more obviously a recognition with a distinctively first personal character. I grasp firsthand the respects in which your dispositions are in some sense proper. But I do have some kind of worries about the moral propriety of a call to grasp some attitudes in this way. It strikes me as distinct from and more morally fraught than the demand to simply recognize that I could have had whatever attitude is in question. I mean, so consider a case in which I, a woman, am invited to empathize with an incel's hateful disdain for me and other women, his perception of me as a femoid, a subhuman creature, fit only for the worst sorts of abuse. Now, I suppose the question is, what sort of empathy should I, the person represented as subhuman by this attitude, have with regard to this hateful disdain? Is it morally incumbent upon me to try to imaginatively represent myself and other women as in some sense the appropriate targets of hateful disdain? Or would even that form of imaginative presentation constitute a kind of betrayal of myself, of my own worth? I ask these questions not as some kind of objection to Fleischacker's view, but rather because I would genuinely like to have a better grip on the answers to them. After all, one of the strengths of Fleischacker's book is yet another trait that it shares with the theory of moral sentiments. It's not just a dry survey of the theoretical landscape vis-a-vis some moral psychological phenomenon. It also issues a compelling call to think seriously about how managing or failing to exercise empathy matters to our own lives. Thanks so much.
Well, thanks so much, Olivia, for those great comments. And now we'll have a second response by Sam Fleischacker.
Thank you so much, Olivia. And I could go on for a long time. I think you open up such fascinating issues that really deserve an extended response, but I'm going to try to observe my time limits and keep it brief. So first of all, to the very interesting challenge from Goldie, as it were, I guess I want to say that I go in two directions. I don't quite go with where Goldie is in that later piece. I follow Goldie quite closely, but mostly from his earlier work, and he was less anti-empathy than he became later on. On the one hand, I want to say, you know, you meet somebody and for the first time and very quickly maybe pick up that they're rather reserved, or that they're a gross extrovert who's very bubbly and so forth. And you don't think to yourself, oh, this person is an introvert, therefore she's saying such and such, or she's doing such and such, therefore she doesn't want me to come and give her a big hug or something like that. Or, oh, this person is an extrovert, so to keep up with him, I have to be equally celebratory, or not take away from the center stage that he wants to occupy, whatever. You just begin to pick up, feel, as it were, what he's like, she's like, and what her responses are likely to be. You begin to do Smithian empathy. I know there's a danger that Katie will say this is really Humean empathy, but I think it's Smithian empathy. You enter into his character and situation quite naturally without having to present that consciously. It's not a propositional matter. You don't say this person has such and such a character, therefore they're doing such and such. You enter into the character at least to some extent. You can withdraw and then realize what you're doing, but I think to some extent it's much more spontaneous than that. On the other hand, I think in our own actions and with regard to our own agency, we are often more self-conscious about our character than Goldie suggests. You know, it's early in the morning, I haven't had my coffee, and I find that I'm being irritable, and then I remind myself, well, I'm the kind of guy who gets quite irritable if I haven't had my coffee yet or whatever, or I haven't had my breakfast. During this whole COVID-19 crisis, I've had tension with my daughter, who is much less risk-taking than I am and thinks that my wife and I are not being good enough about staying in the house, whatever. And in those debates, moments of tension. I do at times remind myself, well, maybe I'm a little bit too much of a risk taker. I don't think enough about, I'm not as worried as I should be because that's part of my character. And then I feed that into how I act and how I think about what I'm doing. So I think to some extent we are less spontaneous in our agency than Goldie suggests. And we are more spontaneously enter into other people's agency. Now, once again, I take the point that we do think about other people's characters in a more distanced way than we think about our own. Once again, here, as in other respects, I think the difference between being me and being you is not as great as he suggests. To some extent, being me is tightly tied up with the ways in which I am you, all the many yous I meet, and to some extent, I am you only insofar as I project ways in which I am myself, which are not entirely spontaneous sometimes. They're sometimes self-conscious. So the other point that I would make with regard to that is Goldie takes it, as many people writing about empathy take it, that the goal of empathy is to get the other person's feelings right. And if I don't, then I'm distorting them. But I don't think that's what Smith thought. In fact, Smith makes quite clear, as he says, the goal is concords, not unisons. We don't reach the same feelings. And the point isn't to understand them. It isn't mind reading. That's not the point of the theory of moral sentiments. The point is to reach a close enough approximation of similar shared feelings via these imaginative exercises that we can respond to people appropriately, shape our own character, help shape other people's character. Empathy, or what Smith calls sympathy, does all kinds of work in our moral lives, but it doesn't really, for him, have much to do with understanding other people correctly. So the question of distortion doesn't come in. So in a sense, or it doesn't come in at least as much as Goldie thinks it does. So I guess in a sense, I'm taking a version of your second option. The ambitions for empathy shouldn't be as high as Goldie says they are. But that's partly because well, we're not trying to get other people's feelings right. We aren't necessarily going to do that. And in that sense, we shouldn't be so worried about what he calls distortion, because this isn't really a matter of seeking truth. It's not a matter of correct representation of a situation. It's a matter of coming to a kind of mutual harmony, emotional harmony. On your points about demonization, I think you're right that at times I slip between talking about failing to imagine and refusing to imagine, but I think what I should say and what I think I meant to say when I wrote the book was that demonization is a matter of refusing to empathize. I think you're quite right that that has to be the point. I think in any case, however, it's very interesting to raise this possibility of imaginative collapse, and you lay that out quite beautifully. What I want to say the difference between imaginative and collapse and demonization amounts to is that if I've just failed to empathize with you, I at least can say, I don't understand. I don't know what's going on. What am I missing? I might turn to you and say, what am I missing? I don't have, or maybe I can't. Maybe if you're an incel or a Nazi or something, I probably don't want to ask you anything. But if I'm simply failing, then I don't have to write you out of humanity. I know that I'm failing. If I refuse to empathize, I'm regarding you as a different kind of creature. Now, to the more difficult question at the end about empathizing, you gave the example of the incel. I think it'll do just as well, at least for me, to think about the Nazi. I certainly don't have to share the Nazis' representation of me as a Jew as evil. I don't think it would be proper to do that. I do think I have to understand how the Nazi might have become a Nazi, how the incel might have become an incel, how they could have gotten to this situation, how they could have gotten to represent people that way. I think that minimally is necessary, and if I don't do that, then I am demonizing the person. Certainly in Smithian empathy, I don't have to agree with you. That's the whole point, that sometimes I will and sometimes I will not regard the way you're feeling as proper. But I do have to at least come to the point where I can understand how you think it's proper and what mistake you're making, as opposed to thinking, well, you're just a different kind of creature who reacts to things in ways different from the way human beings react. And I do think it's essential to empathize, at least in that minimal sense, with everyone, even the Nazis and the incels. As I say in the book, not because I want to be kind to these people necessarily. I don't think they necessarily deserve kindness. That's not the appropriate response in many cases, especially when they're dangerous. But at least, if there is a possibility to come to humanize them or to bring them back into a more full-fledged membership in the human community at large, to take the opportunity. B, to help other people, help prevent other people from becoming Nazis and incels. And C, to understand the dangers in ourselves that could lead us in similar directions. And I think cutting them off, and that's my point, one of the points I make about demonization, I think that was to me very important to make, cutting them off from humanity makes it easier for us not to pay attention to the same kinds of dark impulses in ourselves. And I think only if we recognize that we too could become like that, can we fight against those kinds of impulses. And with that, I'm ready for questions.
Okay, thanks so much, Sam. So we have about 16, 17 minutes. I'll read out the questions. You can keep typing them. You can ask about anything you want. Katie's comments, Olivia's comments, Sam's responses, or more open-ended and general questions about these themes. So there's two so far. So the first one is, it says it's not a question, but just an observation by David Schmitz, and I guess I'll read it because it's written out. So Olivia's point about the limitations of equating empathy with the thought, I could have been him. Wow, didn't see that coming, but it has to be right. When I say that to self, I could just as well be registering a warning to self. Related to empathy, but by no means the same. It could be more like, there, but for the grace of God, go I. And he thanks you, Sam, and he learned something today. So that was sort of an observation, not really a question. I don't know if any of you, Olivia or Sam, want to say anything about that.
I have a little thought, but I'll let Sam take it.
Oh, the only thought I had was that I think that was the point I was trying to make at the end, that for me at least, the point of I could be him, I could be her, is that I look inside and I start understanding more about myself. And one of the points about my anti-demonization polemic is to cut off the easy answers to ourselves about our differences from such people. Olivia, do you mind as well respond?
Yeah, no, I mean, that seems exactly right to me. Kind of one thing that's interesting about your response to me. So one thing you say is that, like, well, what really matters is part of what really matters is trying to understand how they might have become that way, right? And I guess what I wonder about that is, so like someone might say, well, that's a narrative, that's still a narrative kind of understanding, you know, that's still, it's not clear that we strictly need something like a first personal access to be able to afford that kind of understanding. You know, I'm not saying I would say that, I'm just saying that people who are fans of more kind of narrative accounts of understanding other folks might push on that.
Right. Well, there's a point in the book where I take up a debate between Carsten Stuber and I'm forgetting his name right now, defender of the narrative.
I think is who you're thinking of. Yeah.
Who's that?
I think it's Dan Hutto, maybe, is who you're thinking of. Anyway,
no,
go on.
I should have my own interlocutors, but anyway. I'm very sympathetic, as it were, with Stuber's view that we need empathy to understand narrative. Certainly to understand historical narrative, to place myself in, I actually don't agree with you about the Revolutionary War case. And around that time, many Southerners doubted very seriously whether slavery was wrong. Later on, they came to believe that it was perfectly okay. But to enter into some of that later period, the sort of John Calhoun period in which people thought this was perfectly fine and should remain forever, that's really difficult. But still, to understand the narrative, I have to think about, well, what would it be like to be raised in that kind of world? I mean, it is part of what I would want to say to the cases that Katie described too. I don't think it's impossible for a white person to understand what a black person goes through in America, but I think it takes a huge amount of work. But to do that work, you don't just want to read the narrative, you need to be able to place yourself in the narrative. I think. It certainly isn't something that could be done simply, but I definitely think that some kind of Smithian empathy is necessary for grasping the narrative. I mean, that is my response basically to the narratological view of understanding.
Okay, so on the queue now, there's so far just one more question by Selena. The question is, how can a Jungian or Smithian approach of sympathy shed some light on the corruption of social sympathy into fanatical groups?
It's one for all of us. I mean, I do think in some ways, this is where I'm inclined to think that Hume is more helpful than Smith some of the time, partly because of what I take to be the non-cognitive, or at least differently cognitive level of empathy. I mean, that is partly how he explains nationalism. It's how he explains group feeling, and I think he's pretty good at that. I mean, not that that Smith doesn't have something to say about fanaticism as well. He says he thinks of it as something that's characteristic of certain kinds of religious movements in particular. But it's weirder for him. It's harder for him to understand because everyone's supposed to be so busy with this project of understanding one another and entering into one another's shoes. Why would people wind up with these extremist views when, in which, for instance, as he says in the middle of TMS, you know, you could come to the point where you think you can murder innocent people in the name of your religion. And in fact, he says at that point that only religion leads to that kind of a view, which I think is an exaggeration he himself shouldn't have gotten into. I mean, there are political groups that go in the same direction without being necessarily religious. But here I would be inclined to go for at least for a contagious account of empathy, an account of empathy, whether it's Humean or not, in which, you know, well, to take that line that I liked in response to Katie from the beginning of Hume's own account of sympathy, people adopt one another's views, implicitly embrace every opinion proposed to them without thinking about it, and even men of the greatest judgment and understanding who find it very difficult to follow their own reason or inclination in opposition to that of their friends and daily companions. I don't think Smithian empathy is that helpful in understanding that. Yeah.
Yeah, so, and this touches on some of, I mean, look, you're right, Sam, we are never going to settle this. Probably ever, but definitely not today. But I want to separate out, I think I can say something about this question that maybe can help us sort perhaps some of the lines of disagreement or find out where we're not agreeing or not disagreeing maybe. Those initial paragraphs from which you quote in the section on the love of fame are immediately followed by the paragraph in which he lays out the process as I describe it. And that paragraph ends with, this is, I promise in a second, directly related to the question. That paragraph ends with Hume saying, all this proceeds from certain views and reflections which do not escape the strict scrutiny of a philosopher, that they may the person himself who engages in them. So I want to take that as a taking off point and separate out two aspects, two things we can be talking about when we're talking about whether or not sympathy is cognitive. There are many others, but here are two. One is the question of whether a person's reflective capacities are actively engaged in the process of sympathizing and whether that's always true. But another is a question about whether it is cognitively laden in the sense that I was laying out as I think even Hume thinks the most basic form of contagion that's not the infant form is cognitively laden. And that is when I catch somebody's sentiments or beliefs, in particular, you know, even when we're talking about feelings, their pride, their avarice, their anger, all the structure of that affect remains constant throughout the transition. And this in the transition from merely having an idea of what it is that they're feeling to feeling with them. And I think this gives Hume a really good way of explaining this kind of fanaticism, because what's happening is it's not just that I'm agitated around angry people, because what I'm catching is their anger. my own evaluations are deformed by the sympathy, right? And that's why even men of judgment in that first line have their judgments deformed by empathizing with others. And he comes back to this in the very section of this treatise a few pages later, where he says, we have to remember that all of this proceeds both by way of sympathy, which renders another's sentiments intimate and present to us, and by reasoning, which makes us regard their sentiments as a kind of argument for what they affirm, right? And so in this way, we just kind of, what what Freud will later call, when we get this division between philosophy and psychology, a kind of rationalization, right? So I catch the sentiment, and it has all of this evaluative structure built into it. And then reason kicks in, and rather than correcting my own sentiment, it reinforces it, because it makes me regard what I've come to feel as what they're feeling, and now I've come to feel as a kind of argument for what they affirm. Sorry, I get started on that, and it's really hard to speak.
I agree with all that, and I actually see now that our disagreement about Hume is subtler than I thought, and maybe we don't disagree that much, that we're talking about two different levels of cognition. I think that's very helpful. In any case, I certainly agree that Hume's account, especially as you laid it out just now, is better at explaining fanaticism. That makes very good sense. I think Smith is more optimistic that in the process of empathy, I can correct for the mistakes that others are making. I won't necessarily do that, but I can. And I think Hume is less optimistic and maybe more realistic about that.
Yeah. I mean, I think this is part of the reason why Hume thinks it necessary to introduce an entirely different form of empathy or of sympathy to account for our moral sentiments, right?
Yeah.
Extensive sympathy just works in a completely different way. I do want to say, though, that the sort of imagining, I find it heartwarming how far you think we can get, Sam, but whenever you talk about imagining how the Nazi became a Nazi, or the jerk or the bigot became a jerk, the voice in my head is Austen's, JL, not Jane, although it could be Jane, but and J.L. Austin's famous quip in response to the line, to understand all is to forgive all. And he famously quipped in response, that's quite wrong. Sometimes understanding all just adds contempt to hatred, right? And nobody's laughing at that. Look, it's the danger, right? You understand what made the Nazi a Nazi, and now you're more pissed off.
I like that. I end the book with something very similar, actually, a quote from Ordinary German, not Ordinary Germans, the other one, Ordinary People or something like that. The one about the Nazi Brigade 100, I think, Christopher Browning's book, in which he says that in his attempt to understand the Nazis, he's not meaning to forgive them. I don't think forgiveness has to come with this kind of understanding, but I do think a rich understanding is necessary. And I think the understanding, look, I think Forster models beautifully in the 1920s, when very few British people were making any attempt to understand the Indians, what it is like for an Englishman to try to understand India, and comes to a tragic conclusion that isn't going to lead to friendship. And he was right at the time. I don't by this mean, oh, we're all going to, convert Nazis into nice people who we can all get along with, or incels or other kinds of bigots. I do think that the process is necessary anyway, and it can go further. I think this would fit very nicely. I think Smith is more optimistic than Hume, and I may be more optimistic than you. But I respect very much that pessimism can sometimes be the death of realism.
So I'll just say there's now 4 questions on the queue. We can try to take one more, and unless Jeff tells me we can go substantially beyond the next 3 minutes, but let's take at least the next one. How should Smith's theory make sense of whether, so this is from Elliot Gooden, how should Smith's theory make sense of whether we empathize with non-human animals given their cognitive deficits? For instance, they struggle, if not fail, to take on the perspective of my dog during a visit to the veterinary clinic, because I'm aware of the point of his being there, while my dog cannot be aware of that.
We can probably take another one quickly, because I actually have a chapter on empathy in animals, or a chapter that partly deals with that in chapter 3. I don't think Smith is particularly good about that. I agree entirely with the question, and I don't think that's one of the things that Smith handles well. I do think that's another thing that Hume handles better.
Okay, so let's take at least the next one as well, by an anonymous attendee. To what extent is Smith interested in the ways in which we empathize with people in their joys and pleasures, and what more significance does such experience have, by contrast with our empathy in cases where people either experience suffering or hold positions we find unpalatable?
It's one of the first points in the theory of moral sentiments that sympathy is not meant to be, as he understands it, applied sympathy simply to unpleasant feelings like pity. In fact, he says explicitly at one time sympathy, probably in his own time, sympathy is primarily used for our fellow feeling with misery and pain, but he wants to use it more broadly, and he takes sympathy with joy to be very important. And in fact, he has a wonderful chapter on the asymmetry, couple of chapters, between our sympathy with joy and our sympathy with pain, saying we prefer to sympathize with joy, and that's why we all want to talk about and are interested in rich people, because we think they're happy, and we don't pay attention to poor people because we think they're unhappy. So that our asymmetric interest in sympathizing with joy can have some baleful moral effects. It probably also has some good moral effects, but he stresses the bad ones, actually.
Nir, I would take the next two, and then we should stop.
Okay, so we'll do that. So the next one by Zeev Berger, which is, he says it's somewhat related to Katie's remarks, is the following question. A few years back, the NYT ran a highly criticized piece that sought to make Trump voters relatable. Does the Sympathetic Project endorse that kind of work to make political others close? If not, what are the political limits of the Sympathetic Project? Sam, you don't.
So maybe Katie and I should both answer. I have a feeling I know Katie's, and this is again where this disagreement between us is going to come up. Yes, I think it's a very good project. Maybe Katie thinks that it's also a good project, but it's less likely to be successful. No, in fact, part of what I had in mind, I mean, I was working on this from 2015 on, and all into the Trump era. Part of what I had in mind was the difficulty of people like me, and I suspect many of the people on this call, in understanding, relating to the Trump voters, and understanding why West Virginia coal miners might not like Hillary Clinton. And actually, those were the most understandable, I think, but many of the other Trump voters just seemed to us like creatures from another planet. And I appreciate the attempt to make them understandable. That doesn't mean, in my opinion, that we have to like them, but I think it's very important to try to understand them. Katie, did you want to say anything?
These kinds of projects, one thing that people don't, I mean, there's the question of whether or not they succeed. And I do think that there are limits there, that's another conversation that you and I have had sometimes, that they can't succeed. But I actually think that there's another problem that we haven't, Olivia sort of touched on this, that we haven't touched on, which is that for some, let's not talk about Trump voters in general. There are subsets of Trump voters, and we can pick them out in any number of ways. Some of us, in fact, do have experience with those people. I grew up with them in a right-wing town in Colorado. I'm very familiar with these folks. And I think that one of the things that we haven't touched on, and this is now in the territory of Smithian rather than Humean sympathy, is that there's a real danger here. And the danger is that I will lose track of myself, that it's a kind of self-undermining project at the limits, right? And I think that sometimes people don't understand that some of the resistance to the calls to understand the Trump voters are coming from people in positions where they're susceptible to being themselves undermined by that effort.
And I do think that's part of the point of Olivia's example at the end about the incel, and I think there's something to that. I mean, there is a danger in taking on the viewpoint too much, and I didn't deal with that in the book. I do think it's another issue that needs to be addressed.
I mean, I wonder if this isn't the fact, look, women are called upon to do to empathize in this way with men all the time, right? And there's sort of in the back of my head a question whether Olivia and I both went there, because this is, you know, something that's used to undermine women on the regular basis. I imagine lots of people's in sort of relevant non-top positions and hierarchies find themselves in this position.
Okay, so the very last question for today, it's actually a great last question because I know Sam has so much to say about this, is the following. How does the pleasure of sympathetic correspondence weigh against the displeasure of empathizing with unpleasant situations? Smith suggests that it leads you to undergo excessive sympathy and admiration for the rich and annoyance and avoidance of the poor. Is this an inevitable problem for an empathy-based ethics?
So in part, I said something about it before. I think that it's an interesting and I think very valuable consequence of Smith's view that Smith valuably draws attention to, that our empathy will lead us to an excessive admiration for the rich and contempt for the poor. Often not, one of the things Smith brings out nicely, it's not even that we have contempt for them, and it's that we ignore them. We try to turn away from them. We don't pay attention to them. He says the poor man will go in and out of his hovel without attention while everybody pays attention to the rich. And my students often resist that and get very annoyed until I point out to them that People magazine is not filled with stories about homeless people, and that there are, you know, shows on TV and lots of gossip and talks about famous people and people in Hollywood, and then they realize they themselves do it. They're fascinated by the lives of the rich and famous. I think that what Smith is very useful in drawing attention to the problem, and he himself at least implicitly realizes that empathy alone won't solve the problem. In part, it can by our developing more empathy for the poor. That is a group of people we don't empathize with enough. And that's the group that he was most concerned with. He wasn't concerned with our trying to empathize with horrible bigots. He was concerned with our empathizing with the poor. And he's one of the first people, even in the 18th century, even among the sort of more enlightened or liberal folk, as we would like to say, in the 18th century, to really stress the need to empathize with the poor and to bring out their situation in the Wealth of Nations in some detail. So he worked on the project, as I think others can and should, and I think people like Jonathan Kozol or Barbara Ehrenreich have done wonderful work in trying to draw our attention to the details of the lives of the poor, and thereby enabling us to empathize with them as we never would. Never have before. So that's one part of the solution, but another part is to turn to institutions that are impartial and that to some extent transcend empathy, that try to encode a kind of respect for one another, equal respect, impartial respect, a kind of Kantian respect that isn't necessarily based on empathy alone. So I don't argue. I mean, I have written this book about empathy because I think empathy is fascinating. I think it does a lot of very useful work, including work that isn't being paid attention to enough by a number of, by most moral philosophers today. But I don't think it does all the moral work we need. I'm somewhat sympathetic to the critics of empathy, like Jesse Prince and Paul Bloom. I think they go much too far in attacking it, but I do think that the idea that we can have morality based on empathy alone is dangerous, partly for this reason and partly for other reasons, that it can lead us into tribalism and so forth. So the point is to recognize its important place, but to put empathy in the context of other moral tools for the various moral problems that we face.
Katie and Olivia.
That sounds like a good place to stop, Jeff, yes?
This is an excellent place to stop. I really have been delighted by this conversation. I've learned a lot. I discovered I couldn't post my own question, so I'll follow up later with you. But thank you guys for your time and for the interest of what you all had to say. And thank you to everyone who joined us online in this meeting. I appreciate your interest and your attention. Thank you very much.